The 25 Most Amazing Paintings by Paul Cézanne.
Number 25. Self-Portrait with Palette. From 1890 to 1895 AD. Between 1890 and 1895 AD, Paul Cézanne created one of the most representative self-portraits of his production, Self-Portrait with Palette. In this period, the artist had already defined his post-impressionist style, marked by a constant search for structure and solidity in pictorial representation. Unlike traditional self-portraits, in which the artist's gaze is usually the main focus, in this work Cézanne opts for a distant, almost introspective expression. His face, depicted with an economy of detail, conveys a sense of concentration and firmness, reflecting the determination with which he approached painting at this stage of his life. Technically, the work is characterized by a masterful use of color and brushwork. Cézanne employs a palette of earthy and blue tones that contrast with the neutral background, thus achieving a sense of depth without resorting to the illusionistic effects of chiaroscuro. The brushwork is visible and structured, almost as if he were constructing the face from small geometric shapes. This approach aligns with his idea that nature should be represented through cylinders, spheres, and cones, anticipating the influence it would have on cubism. Self-Portrait with Palette is not only a testament to Cézanne's technical maturity, but also to his conception of art as a rigorous and methodical process. At this time, his work no longer sought to capture ephemeral moments, but to construct lasting images that transcended time. This painting is a reflection of his introspective nature and his unwavering conviction in the importance of painting as a means of exploring the structure of the world. An interesting aspect of this work is the absence of superfluous details. Cézanne avoids any decorative or anecdotal elements and focuses on the essential: his face and his palette, the two elements that define his identity as a painter. It is a sincere and uncompromising portrait, in which the artist reveals himself with the same rigor with which he approached painting in general. Number 24. The Kiss of the Muse. 1860. In 1860 AD, Paul Cézanne produced one of his first significant works, The Kiss of the Muse, a painting that reflects his early fascination with academic painting and mythology. At this stage, Cézanne had not yet developed his characteristic post-impressionist style, and his work was influenced by the traditional canons of French art, dominated by realism and symbolism. This work depicts the classical theme of artistic inspiration through the image of a muse kissing a young man, a recurring motif in art history. Technically, The Kiss of the Muse shows a more detailed and careful treatment in the representation of the figures compared to his later works. The brushwork is softer and the color palette remains within a harmonious range, with a predominance of warm and golden tones that evoke the Renaissance painting tradition. Although Cézanne had not yet developed his characteristic approach to construction through geometric forms, there is an interest in the solidity of the figures and the distribution of space on the canvas. In Cézanne's career, this work is significant because it allows us to understand his evolution from an artist who followed academic principles to one who would challenge them with a radically new vision. During these years, Cézanne struggled to find his voice within an artistic environment that still favored grand historical and mythological narratives, but his restlessness led him to experiment with new forms and techniques that would distance him from these conventions. A curious fact about this painting is that, despite its classical subject matter, some features that would define Cézanne's work in the future can already be perceived. The composition, although still influenced by academicism, shows an arrangement of elements that suggests a concern for structure and balance. This interest in the organization of space would be one of the fundamental characteristics of his later work and the basis on which he would build his artistic legacy. Number 23. The House with the Cracked Wall. From 1892 to 1894. At the end of the 19th century, Paul Cézanne was consolidating his mature style, exploring the architecture of nature through simplified forms and a vibrant color palette. The House with the Cracked Wall is a reflection of his fascination with structural solidity and the play of light on surfaces, capturing the essence of the world through his unique perception. The seemingly simple scene hides a deep study of geometry and the decomposition of form, marking a milestone in his transition towards a pictorial language that would influence movements such as Cubism in the 20th century. The painting depicts a rural house, humble in appearance, with a central wall showing obvious signs of deterioration. However, what at first glance might seem like a simple representation of decay actually becomes an analysis of the interaction between volumes and chromatic planes. Cézanne avoids traditional perspective, using constructive brushstrokes that fragment the space and generate a feeling of unbreakable solidity. The choice of ochre, green and blue tones contributes to the feeling of harmony, while light filters through subtly, highlighting the materiality of the structure. This work is significant in Cézanne's production because it demonstrates his ability to transform an everyday scene into a complex study of form and color. The house is not just a depicted object, but a living structure that engages in dialogue with its surroundings through pictorial treatment. The crack in the wall is not a mere architectural detail, but a metaphor for the passage of time and the persistence of matter, elements that the artist explored insistently in his later years. Curiously, Cézanne's obsession with visual stability is reflected in the way he repeated certain themes, reworking his compositions until he found the ideal structure. This desire to perfect the harmony of his canvases was misunderstood by many contemporaries, but over time it revealed itself as a fundamental pillar in the evolution of modern art. Number 22. Woman with Coffee Pot. From 1890 to 1895. At the end of the 19th century, Paul Cézanne was in the midst of exploring the human figure, a field that, although less frequent in his production than landscapes or still lifes, allowed him to develop his particular vision of form and composition. Woman with Coffee Pot is a clear example of this experimentation, where the representation of the female figure moves away from conventional naturalism to delve into an almost sculptural treatment of volume and pictorial structure. The work is part of a series of portraits that the artist made with an austere approach and deliberately distanced from sentimental expressiveness. The central figure, a woman with a rigid face and an absent gaze, is presented with imperturbable dignity. Dressed simply and sitting with her hands in her lap, the composition is articulated around a geometrical form that dispenses with anecdotal details. The coffee pot on the table is not a mere accessory, but an element that reinforces the stability of the scene, contributing to the visual balance of the work. Cézanne uses a palette of muted tones and dense brushstrokes that emphasize the materiality of the oil, giving the painting an almost tactile presence. The artist's interest in volumetric construction is evident in the modeling of the figure, which appears more sculpted than painted. Unlike traditional portraits, where the emphasis was on the psychology of the model, Cézanne focuses on the relationship between shapes and colors, establishing a tension between the stasis of the character and the internal vibration of the painting. This innovative vision distanced him from the portrait painters of his time, but laid the foundations for a new way of understanding figuration in the 20th century. It is fascinating that, despite the apparent coldness of the portrait, the work manages to convey a sense of serene monumentality. Cézanne does not seek to capture a fleeting moment, but a universal plastic truth, constructed through light, color, and structure. Therein lies the timelessness of his art. Number 21. The Temptation of Saint Anthony. from 1875 to 1877. During the second half of the 19th century, Paul Cézanne ventured into a series of works with mythological and religious themes, exploring a more expressive and dramatic pictorial language than that which would characterize his later work. The Temptation of Saint Anthony is one of the most intriguing pieces from this period, as it moves away from the serenity and geometric balance that would define his maturity to immerse itself in a universe of agitated forms and marked contrasts. Inspired by the pictorial tradition of previous centuries, the painting is part of a long series of interpretations of the famous trial of the Holy Hermit, whose fight against demonic visions was a recurring theme in European art. The work features a dynamic composition, with distorted figures writhing in a dense, oppressive atmosphere. The figure of Saint Anthony, at the center of the scene, faces a whirlwind of fantastic creatures emerging from the darkness. Cézanne uses violent brushstrokes and intense colors to accentuate the dreamlike character of the scene, achieving a feeling of restlessness and constant movement. Unlike other, more narrative representations of the episode, here the tension lies not in the struggle between good and evil, but in the very materiality of the painting, which seems to overflow from the canvas with uncontrollable energy. This painting is essential to understanding Cézanne's evolution, as it shows his interest in pure expressiveness before his work turned towards the rational construction of space. Although he would later abandon this approach in favor of greater structure, The Temptation of Saint Anthony reveals a lesser-known side of the artist, in which pictorial gesture and raw emotion predominate over formal restraint. It is curious to note that this work, despite its intensity, did not have the same resonance as his landscapes or still lifes. However, it contains the seed of an exploration that, decades later, would be taken up by the avant-garde movements of the 20th century, demonstrating that even in his most extreme experiments, Cézanne was redefining the pictorial language of his time. Number 20. The Maincy Bridge. From 1879 to 1880. In the panorama of 19th century painting, Paul Cézanne stood out as a visionary artist whose work challenged established canons and served as a bridge between Impressionism and the first avant-garde movements of the 20th century. The bridge at Maincy, created between 1879 and 1880 AD, is an exceptional example of his technical evolution and his exploration of pictorial structure. Cézanne was not content with the ephemeral capture of light, as the Impressionists did. His concern was with the solid construction of nature and the geometrization of the landscape. This work, created during his stay in the town of Maincy, near Fontainebleau, reveals his growing interest in the simplification of forms and the study of depth through the use of color. In the painting, the stone bridge becomes the protagonist of the composition, framed by dense vegetation that almost seems to devour its structure. Cézanne moves away from pure naturalism and opts for broad, directional brushstrokes that suggest volumes rather than defined contours. Through a palette dominated by deep greens, earthy browns, and touches of blue, he achieves a sense of harmony that transcends the merely visual and approaches the essential structure of the landscape. The water under the bridge, rather than being a traditional reflective surface, is fragmented into thick brushstrokes that give it an almost sculptural quality, anticipating the formal experiments that would influence later generations. Cézanne's interest in geometrical and stable composition is evident in the arrangement of the elements. The bridge is not only a point of transit within the scene, but a structure that organizes the viewer's perception. His insistence on solid forms and planes of color as constructive elements announces the future Cubism, a movement that would find in Cézanne its undisputed precursor. This work, in particular, evidences his constant struggle between the faithful representation of nature and the need for a pictorial structure independent of mere observation. One of the most striking features of the bridge at Maincy is that it is not limited to being a representation of a specific landscape, but rather it encapsulates the essence of nature as Cézanne saw it. This painting is not just a bucolic scene, but a visual manifesto of his artistic theory. In it, the artist seeks to make something solid and lasting like museum art, a statement that would define his later work. Number 19. Le Bassin du Jas de Bouffan, 1876. Le Bassin du Jas de Bouffan, painted in 1876 AD, is a work in which Paul Cézanne masterfully captures his connection with the rural environment and his progressive independence from Impressionism. This painting depicts a view of the artist's family estate, Jas de Bouffan, in Aix-en-Provence, a place that would become a visual laboratory where he would explore his ideas about landscape structure and the use of color. Cézanne, unlike the Impressionists who sought to capture the ephemeral effects of light, focused on constructing the landscape with solidity and stability, giving each element an immutable presence within the composition. In the scene, the pond dominates the foreground, surrounded by trees that seem to structure the space with a calculated naturalness. The brushstrokes, although energetic and visibly applied with a certain geometric intention, achieve a balance between the organic nature of the place and the internal structure of the work. Cézanne introduces a harmony of green, blue, and ochre tones that, although evoking the reality of the environment, at the same time seem to be abstracted in a logic proper to painting. His approach is not descriptive, but analytical. Each reflection in the water and each shadow projected respond to a conscious construction of pictorial space. Through the arrangement of the trees, the artist achieves a sense of depth without resorting to traditional perspective, something that would be a constant in his later work. The scene is not just a representation of the pond, but an exploration of how color and shape can generate volume without relying on linear contours. This concern with the structuring of space, which would later influence artists such as Picasso and Braque, is already evident at this stage. The most fascinating thing about Le Bassin du Jas de Bouffan is that it is not just a landscape, but a synthesis of Cézanne's worldview. His treatment of light is not merely luminous, but architectural, making the scene appear constructed rather than painted. This approach would pave the way for the development of modern art, setting a crucial precedent for the evolution of painting in the 20th century. Number 18. The Black Clock, from 1867 to 1869. The Black Watch, painted between 1867 and 1869 AD, is one of Paul Cézanne's early works in which we can see the signs of his later style. At this period, the artist had not yet fully developed his distinctive pictorial language, but he was already beginning to move away from academicism to explore looser brushwork and a more intuitive construction of space. This work is distinguished by its introspective atmosphere and its composition charged with visual tension, elements that reflect the influence of realism and, in some ways, anticipate his break with conventional representation. In the scene, a black clock becomes the central axis of the composition, standing out for its heavy volume and its immutable presence. The table on which it rests and the surrounding objects create an atmosphere of almost ominous stillness, where time seems suspended. Cézanne, at this stage, still experiments with the effects of light and depth, but he does so in a less impressionistic way and more closely tied to the materiality of the objects. The brushwork is dense, with a use of color that emphasizes three-dimensionality rather than dissolving the forms in the light. The sense of space in this painting is peculiar. Although perspective exists, it is not entirely orthodox. Cézanne begins to challenge the traditional arrangement of planes, something that would eventually become one of his most innovative characteristics. The rigidity of the clock contrasts with the relative fluidity of the other elements of the scene, generating a visual dynamic that adds psychological depth to the work. Beyond its apparent simplicity, the black clock represents a key moment in Cézanne's career. In it, the foundations of his pictorial theory can already be perceived, although in an incipient form. The clock, a symbol of the passage of time, can also be interpreted as a metaphor for his artistic process, a constant search for solidity and permanence within the pictorial language. Number 17. Harlequin. From 1888 to 1890. Paul Cézanne, a key figure in the transition between Impressionism and Cubism, created a captivating representation of the emblematic figure of the Italian Commedia dell'arte in Harlequin. In this work, the artist not only demonstrates his mastery of color and composition, but also reveals his exploration of the geometrization of forms, anticipating the artistic developments of the 20th century. The Harlequin, a character traditionally associated with agility and mischief, appears here in a pose of almost sculptural stillness, with a rigidity that contrasts with the vibrant diamond-patterned clothing that envelops him. Cézanne, with his characteristic fragmented stroke, gives the scene an atmosphere of depth and volume without resorting to traditional chiaroscuro. At the end of the 19th century, the artistic world was undergoing a transformation, with the gradual disappearance of traditional realism and the emergence of new currents that challenged classical canons. Cézanne, with his insistence on the underlying structure of reality, explores in Harlequin the relationship between figure and background, giving the scene an unusual solidity for a theatrical motif. The color palette, although apparently vibrant, is carefully balanced by subtle contrasts that reinforce three-dimensionality. His departure from impressionist optical effects and his search for a more constructed and rational painting is evident. This work is a testament to the evolution of Cézanne's style, who, in those years, was working intensely on the exploration of form and structure. Harlequin is not only a representation of the theatrical character, but it becomes a pretext for experimenting with the juxtaposition of flat colors and volumes, an exercise in pictorial synthesis that influenced generations of later artists. The sense of stasis and the use of defined planes anticipate the principles of Cubism, a movement that figures such as Picasso and Braque would develop a few decades later. Despite its apparent thematic simplicity, this work contains a fascinating complexity. Cézanne does not seek to capture a fleeting moment, as an impressionist would do, but to establish a timeless relationship between the figure and its surroundings. In this search for a solid pictorial structure, Harlequin becomes a turning point in the artist's work, revealing his ability to transform a traditional motif into a radical exploration of form and color. Number 16. Still Life with Cherub, 1895. In Still Life with Cherub, Paul Cézanne demonstrates his mastery of composition and his ability to endow a genre that had historically been considered minor with monumentality. In this work, the artist does not limit himself to representing objects in a decorative manner, but rather elevates them to a structural category, exploring the relationship between volumes, colors, and planes. The inclusion of the sculpture of a cherub introduces a narrative element that is unusual in his still lifes, adding an almost sculptural component to the composition. The 19th century marked a period of transformation for still life as a pictorial genre. Cézanne, moving away from the excessive detail of the Baroque and the anecdotal nature of some 18th century representations, focused on the geometrization of elements, consolidating a method that would profoundly influence the avant-garde movements of the 20th century. In Still Life with Cherub, the objects are not arranged randomly. Each element responds to an internal logic of balance and tension, creating a harmonious structure where three-dimensionality is built through the superposition of colors. The use of light in this work is particularly revealing. Unlike traditional chiaroscuro, Cézanne models the forms through chromatic variation, achieving volumetric effects without the need for dramatic shadows. The texture of the objects is perceived with an almost tactile vibration, thanks to his short, overlapping brushstrokes, which give the scene a sense of internal movement. The cherub, with its stony appearance, contrasts with the organic nature of the fruits and the softness of the cloths, establishing a dialogue between the inert and the perishable. This painting encapsulates the essence of the Cézanne method, a tireless search for the underlying structure of reality. Beyond its apparent simplicity, Still Life with Cherub is a manifesto on pictorial construction, a work that challenges perception and establishes a bridge between tradition and modernity. It is no coincidence that artists such as Matisse and Picasso found in Cézanne's still lifes an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Number 15. The Saint-Victoire Mountain Scene from Bellevue. 1885. The Montagne Saint-Victoire was a recurring obsession in the work of Paul Cézanne, who depicted it on multiple occasions throughout his career. In the Montagne Saint-Victoire scene from Bellevue, the artist does not limit himself to capturing a landscape, but breaks it down into planes of color, exploring the relationship between nature and pictorial structure. Cézanne does not pursue a representation faithful to optical reality, but rather reconstructs the landscape from an intellectual perspective, where stability and harmony emerge through the arrangement of shapes and tones. In the context of the 19th century, this approach to landscape painting was profoundly innovative. While the Impressionists sought to capture the fleeting nature of light and moment, Cézanne focused on the permanence and solidity of the scene. In the Mountain Saint-Victoire scene from Bellevue, the color palette is dominated by blues, greens, and ochres, creating a serene and balanced atmosphere. The brushwork, fragmented and deliberate, is superimposed in layers that build depth without resorting to traditional perspective. This approach reveals Cézanne's profound influence on the evolution of modern painting. His insistence on the underlying structure of the landscape anticipates the principles of Cubism, where representation is based on the interrelation of geometric planes. Unlike the Romantic landscape painters, who sought to evoke subjective emotion, Cézanne is interested in the internal logic of the composition, giving the mountain an almost architectural presence. Mont Saint-Victoire, located in the Provence region, was not only a recurring motif in his work, but also represented a connection to his homeland. Cézanne saw in this mountain a symbol of stability and resilience, a reflection of his own struggle to establish a new way of understanding painting. Through this representation, he transforms a simple landscape into a meticulous exploration of color and form, leaving an indelible mark on the history of art. Number 14. The Card Players, 4 People. From 1890 to 1892. In the late 19th century, Paul Cézanne began to consolidate his unique painting style, distancing himself from the Impressionists and delving into a deep exploration of form and color. In The Card Players, 4 Persons, created between 1890 and 1892, Cézanne captures the essence of an intimate scene, seemingly simple but loaded with technical and symbolic complexity. The work is part of a series in which the artist studied different versions of the same theme, gradually reducing the number of figures to concentrate on the geometric structure of the composition. The scene shows 4 men immersed in a game of cards, with serene faces and heavy bodies, as if time had stopped in an eternal instant. What makes this work unique is its treatment of form and color. Cézanne uses an earthy palette, in which browns, ochres, and muted blues predominate, achieving an atmosphere of contemplation and concentration. The brushstrokes, unlike traditional Impressionism, do not seek to capture fleeting light, but rather to construct solid volumes that give weight to the figures. The arrangement of the figures and the table is based on a rigorous geometric structure, with an almost architectural balance that anticipates 20th century Cubism. The background is devoid of superfluous details, which directs attention exclusively to the central scene and reinforces the feeling of immobility and psychological depth. This painting represents a key moment in the evolution of Cézanne, who by this time was already recognized as an artist who challenged established pictorial conventions. The insistence on geometric construction and simplification of forms would inspire artists such as Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, who would consider him a fundamental precursor of Cubism. In addition, the theme of the card players is part of a pictorial tradition that had been explored by artists such as the Lenain brothers in the 17th century, but Cézanne reinvents it from a modern and analytical perspective. Interestingly, each version of the card players reflects a progressive reduction of elements, a process that would culminate in one of the most iconic versions with only 2 figures, where the spatial relationship and psychological tension are further intensified. Despite its apparent simplicity, the work is a manifesto of Cézanne's pictorial theory, which proposed seeing nature in terms of cylinders, spheres, and cones, thus revolutionizing the artistic perception of his time. Number 13. Pyramid of Skulls, 1901. At the beginning of the 20th century, Paul Cézanne was in a period of introspection and pictorial experimentation. Pyramid of Skulls, painted in 1901, is an unusual work in his oeuvre, both in its subject matter and its execution. In this canvas, the artist abandons traditional still lifes of fruit and household objects to delve into a raw and symbolic representation of death. The image of 3 skulls stacked in the form of a pyramid on a flat surface, without additional elements, generates a feeling of emptiness and disturbing silence. Cézanne is not interested in a morbid or dramatic treatment, but in formal structure and the relationship between forms. The color is limited and austere, with ochre, beige, and brown tones predominating, with deep shadows that accentuate the 3-dimensionality of the skulls. The brushwork is visible and dense, almost sculpting the shapes through the pictorial material. Unlike the traditional vanitas of the 17th century, where skulls were often accompanied by hourglasses, books, or extinguished candles to allude to the passage of time and the transience of life, Cézanne opts for a direct and distraction-free representation. His geometric approach highlights the volumetric construction and the spatial relationship between the skulls, eliminating any anecdotal narrative. This work has a special significance within Cézanne's corpus, as it reflects his interest in the essential and his constant concern for the transience of existence. In his later years, the painter lived with a growing sense of isolation, marked by an obsession with structure and pure form. It is known that Cézanne kept skulls in his studio, probably as study models, but in this painting they do not seem to be inert objects, but presences that impose a reflection on mortality. One of the most intriguing aspects of Pyramid of Skulls is its relationship to art history and the anticipation of future movements. The radical simplification of form and attention to geometric structures make this work a precursor to Cubism, as are many of his later compositions. Furthermore, its raw materiality and symbolic charge could be linked to 20th century Expressionism, in which painting becomes a vehicle for deep, existential emotions. Number 12. Self-Portrait with Wrinkled Hat, 1875. By the mid-1870s, Paul Cézanne was at a crucial stage in his artistic development. Self-Portrait with a Crumpled Hat, painted in 1875, reflects a moment of self-assertion and technical exploration in his career. Unlike conventional portraits of the time, in which the artist sought to flatter the subject or capture a fleeting moment, Cézanne is rendered introspective and analytical, emphasizing solidity of form over emotional expression. His gaze is steady and penetrating, and his face, modeled with thick, structured brushstrokes, conveys a sense of gravity and determination. Color plays a fundamental role in the construction of the image. Instead of bright tones or marked contrasts, Cézanne uses a sober palette with shades of brown, green, and ochre that give it an earthy and dense air. The brushstrokes, far from being soft or blurred, are visible and marked, giving the face a sensation of almost sculptural volume. The wrinkled hat is not a mere accessory, but an element that reinforces the sensation of texture and materiality, connecting the figure with the surrounding atmosphere. This self-portrait is relevant to his work because it allows us to understand his stylistic evolution. Although in his youth he was influenced by Romanticism and Baroque painting, towards the 1870s he began to distance himself from these references to construct his own language. In this painting we can already perceive the foundations of his obsession with structure and form, aspects that would define his mature work. Instead of focusing on the fleeting nature of light, as the Impressionists did, Cézanne sought the permanence of matter, an idea that would later influence the artistic movements of the 20th century. One of the most striking aspects of this work is its ability to convey the artist's personality without resorting to exaggerated drama. Through a rigorous construction of the face and a precise use of color, Cézanne manages to capture his own image with a psychological depth and structural solidity that anticipates his future pictorial revolution. Number 11. The Blue Glass. From 1883 to 1887, Paul Cézanne, one of the key figures in the transition from 19th to 20th century art, developed in the blue vase a visual language that challenged traditional norms of painting. In this period of his career, Cézanne moved away from mere imitation of reality and began to build his compositions through simplified forms and a balanced chromatic palette. This work is a clear example of his exploration of still life, a genre that allowed him to study the relationship between objects and the space around them. Here, each element seems carefully placed to create a compositional balance that goes beyond simple visual representation. The technique used in the blue vase demonstrates Cézanne's meticulous approach to the arrangement of objects and the application of color. Using dense, overlapping brushstrokes, he managed to give the painted surface a vibrant texture that accentuates the volumes. The central vase, in a deep blue, acts as the focal point of the work, standing out among the warm, earthy tones of the rest of the composition. The way in which the shadows and lights are distributed suggests the three-dimensionality of the objects, without losing the flatness characteristic of his style. His particular interest in geometric construction is perceived in the arrangement of the table and the way in which the objects seem structured beyond a simple traditional perspective. This work is significant in Cézanne's artistic evolution because it shows his departure from Impressionism and his approach to a more structured and solid style. While he maintained the exploration of color and light that he had learned from the Impressionists, he focused on the stability and permanence of forms, which would influence the Cubists decades later. Cézanne did not seek the fleeting nature of an instant, but rather the construction of a timeless image, where objects remain in balance and interrelate harmoniously. The artist's use of perspective in the blue vase is particularly intriguing. Rather than following a single line of flight, he seems to fragment space into multiple overlapping planes. This break with traditional Renaissance perspective anticipates many of the innovations that would mark 20th century art. In this still life, Cézanne does not simply capture an instant, but deconstructs and reconfigures it with his own logic, demonstrating his unique vision of pictorial reality. Number 10. Bathers. 1899. Paul Cézanne devoted a significant part of his work to the exploration of the human figure in the landscape, and Bathers is one of his most emblematic pieces within this theme. This painting belongs to a series in which the artist studied the human body in relation to nature, abandoning the academic approach to develop a more abstract and structured vision. At the end of the 19th century, when European art was torn between the last manifestations of academicism and the emergence of new avant-garde movements, Cézanne positioned himself in an intermediate point, redefining the fundamental principles of painting. In Bathers, the human figures are integrated into the landscape in an almost sculptural way. Their bodies are not detailed with anatomical precision, but are reduced to simplified geometric shapes that dialogue with the environment. The composition is organized around a pyramidal structure, with the bodies arranged in harmony with the trees and the sky, suggesting a deep connection between the human figure and nature. The earthy, ochre, and blue tones generate a serene, almost ethereal atmosphere, which emphasizes the sense of timelessness of the scene. The treatment of the human figure in this work marked a break with classical traditions of the nude. Whereas in Renaissance art bodies were often depicted with an ideal of beauty and perfection, Cézanne dispensed with anatomical detail and prioritized compositional structure. Each bather seems to form part of a visual system in which individuality is diluted in favor of the whole. This approach would inspire generations of later artists, including Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, who saw in Cézanne an inexhaustible source of innovation. The most interesting thing about Bathers is that, although the scene suggests a moment of leisure and relaxation, the pictorial treatment conveys a sense of rigidity and permanence. It is not a fleeting instant, as in Impressionist paintings, but a slow and thoughtful construction. Cézanne did not seek to capture the changing light of a moment, but to construct an image that transcends time, making it one of the most influential works of modernity. Number 9. Still life with curtain and jug. From 1893 to 1894. Within Paul Cézanne's vast output, his still lifes occupy a central place, and Still Life with Curtain and Jug is an excellent example of his exploration of the relationship between objects, space, and form. During the 19th century, still life painting was often considered a minor genre, but Cézanne challenged this idea by turning these studies into a field of pictorial experimentation. In this work, the arrangement of the elements and the use of color reveal his intention to structure the composition in such a way that the objects take on an almost sculptural presence. The jug and the fruit are not simply placed on a table, but seem to exist within a carefully constructed system of balance. The curtain falling to one side introduces a dynamic element that breaks up the rigidity of the composition, creating an interesting contrast between the stability of the objects and the fluidity of the fabric. The perspective, as in many of Cézanne's works, is deliberately distorted. Rather than following a single vanishing point, each element seems to be seen from a slightly different angle, which contributes to the sense of depth without relying on traditional perspective. The use of color in this painting is another of its most notable aspects. Cézanne employed a palette rich in warm and cool tones, applying brushstrokes in such a way that the transitions of light and shadow are subtle but effective. The technique of short, modulated brushstrokes allows him to give volume to objects without the need for defined contours. This way of applying color directly influenced the development of Cubism, as it anticipated the idea of representing multiple perspectives on the same plane. Although the work depicts everyday objects, The way in which Cézanne arranges and paints them elevates them to a level of abstraction that transcends simple representation. It is in this type of still life that the artist consolidated his revolutionary vision of painting, stripping objects of their mere decorative function to turn them into protagonists of a new pictorial language. The sense of stability and balance, combined with the distortion of perspective, creates a visual effect that continues to fascinate viewers to this day. Number 8. The Hanged Man's House in Auvers. From 1872 to 1873. The Hanged Man's House at Auvers is one of Paul Cézanne's first significant paintings and is a testament to the artist's transition from his early, dark romantic influences towards a more structured exploration of the landscape. During this period, Cézanne found himself heavily influenced by nature and working outdoors, largely through the influence of Camille Pissarro. In this canvas, the depiction of the house and its surroundings evokes an air of mystery and uncertainty, with dense brushstrokes and muted colors contrasting with the luminosity that would later characterize his work. This work is situated at a key moment within Impressionism, although it already shows signs of the artist's later evolution. Technically, the painting features a solid composition where the shapes of the house and the surrounding vegetation are structured with thick brushstrokes, a characteristic that Cézanne would refine over time. Unlike other Impressionists who sought to capture the immediacy of light and color, Cézanne was more interested in the structure of objects, in their volume and permanence. In the House of the Hanged Man at Auvers, this interest is manifest in the way the architecture of the house seems to merge with the natural surroundings, creating a visual unity between the built world and nature. This work is particularly relevant in Cézanne's career because it marks a turning point in his style. Although certain influences of Romanticism and Impressionism can still be seen, the structure of the composition and the treatment of color foreshadow his path towards Post-Impressionism. Over time, the artist would abandon the traditional Impressionist technique to develop his own pictorial language based on the geometrization of forms and a meticulous exploration of color. The name of the work comes from a local legend suggesting that the house depicted had been the scene of a hanging, although there are no concrete records to confirm this. Beyond this possible background, the painting is an excellent example of Cézanne's interest in the tension between the natural and the built, a theme he would explore throughout his career with an increasingly abstract and structural approach. Number 7. Madame Cézanne in a Red Armchair. 1877. The portrait of Madame Cézanne in a red armchair is one of the most iconic depictions of Hortense Ficquet, Paul Cézanne's wife. In this work, the artist moves away from the conventional portraits of the time, focusing on an introspective composition and an exploration of color and form. The neutral background and subdued lighting allow attention to be fully focused on the figure of Madame Cézanne, whose impenetrable expression has been the subject of multiple interpretations over time. Technically, this painting is notable for its deliberate use of warm, red tones, which contrast with the sitter's pale face and more subdued clothing. Cézanne uses dense, overlapping brushstrokes, creating a sense of volume and three-dimensionality without relying on traditional methods of shading. The geometric structure of the painting suggests an interest in the solidity of forms, something that would later define his style and lead to an influence on Cubism. This portrait is fundamental in Cézanne's artistic evolution, as it shows his rejection of idealized portraits and his preference for a more analytical representation of the human figure. Rather than seeking to capture the personality of the sitter through her facial expression or gestures, Cézanne seems more interested in the overall composition of the image, in the relationship between color and form. This approach distinguishes him from other portrait painters of the time and positions him as an innovator within Post-Impressionism. Curiously, Cézanne painted his wife on more than 20 occasions throughout his life, but never with a marked or emotional expression. This detail has led to various speculations about their relationship, although it is most likely that his interest lay in pictorial exploration rather than in the psychological representation of the model. Number 6. The Boy in the Red Vest. From 1888 to 1890. The Boy in the Red Waistcoat is one of Paul Cézanne's most celebrated works and one of his most successful explorations into the field of portraiture. The painting shows a young model wearing a red waistcoat sitting in a slightly bent pose, with his gaze downcast and a lost expression. This seemingly simple image is actually a complex study of visual structure and color harmony. In technical terms, the painting is characterized by its construction through blocks of color and by the fusion between the background and the figure. Cézanne uses a carefully balanced color palette where the red tones of the waistcoat contrast with the blues and greens of the surroundings, achieving a sense of stability and cohesion in the composition. In addition, the brushwork is more restrained and structured compared to his early works, which shows his evolution towards a more architectural pictorial approach. This work is fundamental to Cézanne's production because it represents his absolute mastery of color and form. Unlike traditional portraits, where the identity and expression of the sitter are central, Cézanne places greater emphasis on the arrangement of elements within the canvas. His technique would influence later movements such as Cubism, as artists such as Picasso and Braque found a source of inspiration in his geometric approach. An interesting detail about this work is that Cézanne painted several versions of the same subject, with slight variations in the model's posture and lighting. This indicates his interest in experimentation and the search for a perfect composition, beyond the realistic representation of the character. In this sense, The Boy in the Red Waistcoat is a clear example of Cézanne's meticulous thinking, who saw painting not only as a form of representation, but as a visual construction in itself. Number 5. The Basket of Apples. 1893. In the 19th century, Paul Cézanne revolutionized painting by challenging traditional norms of perspective and composition. The Basket of Apples is a paradigmatic example of this innovation. In this work, the rules of traditional realism are distorted in favor of a fragmented view of the world, in which objects appear to be in delicate balance. The tilt of the table, the instability of the basket, and the apparent disconnection between elements suggest a radical reinterpretation of visual perception, foreshadowing the cubism that would emerge in the 20th century. Cézanne did not simply copy reality. Instead, he reconstructed it on canvas, exploring the nature of form and color. The color palette of the work is characteristic of the artist, with a range of ochres, greens, and reds that give the painting an internal vibration. Cézanne's brushwork is evident, fragmented and built from small patches of color that, seen together, generate a sense of volume and structure. Unlike other Impressionist painters, Cézanne does not seek to capture a fleeting moment of light, but rather a deeper truth about the relationship between objects and the space they inhabit. This technique would influence generations of later artists, consolidating Cézanne as a key figure in the transition to modernity. In the context of his career, this painting represents a consolidation of his studies of still life, a genre that Cézanne explored insistently throughout his life. While many painters considered still lifes to be a minor exercise in art, Cézanne turned them into laboratories of visual experimentation. His interest in simple forms, the repetition of motifs, and the interaction between light and matter reach an exceptional maturity in this work. The fact that Picasso and Braque were inspired by these explorations in the development of Cubism is proof of Cézanne's lasting impact on the history of art. One of the most intriguing aspects of this painting is its apparent lack of stability. Upon closer inspection, it is clear that the perspective of the table does not conform to the laws of Euclidean geometry, leading to a sense of movement and uncertainty. Cézanne was not interested in an exact representation, but in the sense of reality that the human eye perceives in fragments. It is precisely this tension between order and chaos, between what is seen and what is reconstructed, that makes the Basket of Apples one of his most enigmatic and fascinating works. Number 4. Apples and Oranges. From 1895 to 1900. By the end of the 19th century, Paul Cézanne was already a fully fledged artist, and his series of still lifes with fruit represents one of the high points of his career. Apples and Oranges exemplifies his tireless quest to structure painting through color and form, leaving aside the conventions of traditional representation. In this work, Cézanne pushes his obsession with unstable stability to the limit, where objects seem suspended in a precarious harmony. Although the elements are arranged with an almost mathematical precision, the slight distortion of perspective breaks with any compositional rigidity, achieving a sense of dynamism and tension. The use of color in this painting is masterful. Cézanne applied layers of warm and cool tones to model the volumes, a technique that would later be fundamental to the evolution of modern art. The apples and oranges are not just objects within the composition, but become living pictorial entities, with a materiality that seems to oscillate between solidity and transience. This way of treating light and color does not seek the optical illusionism of academic realism, but rather a deeper and more structural perception of reality. Cézanne's interest in still lifes lay in their potential to study the underlying geometry of nature. In this work, the fruit, the table, and the folds of the tablecloth are not mere representations, but plastic elements that Cézanne arranges in a carefully orchestrated visual balance. This insistence on pictorial construction would later inspire artists such as Matisse and Picasso, who saw in Cézanne the bridge between tradition and the avant-garde. A particularly striking detail of apples and oranges is the apparent autonomy of each object within the ensemble. There is no clear visual hierarchy, and yet the work maintains absolute coherence. Cézanne achieved this unity through a meticulous distribution of color and form, generating an internal rhythm that gives the painting an almost sculptural presence. This ability to endow the everyday with artistic transcendence is what makes Cézanne an undisputed master of modern painting. Number 3. The Card Players. From 1890 to 1895. At the end of the 19th century, Paul Cézanne undertook an ambitious project, the creation of a series of paintings dedicated to card players. Of all of them, the most famous version is the one we know today as The Card Players. This work, far from being a simple representation of an everyday scene, becomes a profound study of human psychology and the relationship between space and form. In it, Cézanne reduces the scene to its purest essence: two static figures, concentrated on the game, surrounded by a dense and silent atmosphere. The composition is austere, almost geometric. The two figures are arranged symmetrically, creating a visual balance reminiscent of classical constructions. However, instead of a rigid academicism, Cézanne introduces slight distortions in perspective and in the arrangement of objects that give the scene a subtle but constant tension. The color, applied in dense and modulated layers, reinforces the solidity of the figures and gives the work an unusual monumentality for such an apparently trivial subject. Unlike the Impressionist painters, who sought to capture the fleeting nature of the moment, Cézanne pursued a timeless representation, where time seems to have stopped. The players' faces are impenetrable, their gestures minimal, their relationship based on mutual concentration. The absence of explicit emotion is not an oversight, but a deliberate choice that emphasizes the universality of the subject. Cézanne does not paint concrete individuals, but human archetypes, figures that could have existed at any time. One of the most fascinating features of this work is its profound influence on 20th century art. Picasso and Braque, in their development of Cubism, carefully studied the way Cézanne fragmented space and rearranged forms within the composition. This restructuring of visual reality marked the turning point between classical art and modernity. Cézanne, with his apparent simplicity, managed to transform painting into a completely new language, where structure and color became absolute protagonists. Number 2. The Saint-Victoire Mountain Series. From 1882 to 1906. For more than 2 decades, Paul Cézanne devoted a significant part of his oeuvre to the depiction of the mountain of Saint-Victoire, a recurring motif in his artistic production that encapsulates his stylistic evolution and his search for a new way of depicting nature. This series, begun in 1882 AD and continued until 1906 AD, encompasses a diversity of approaches and techniques, revealing Cézanne's transformation from an impressionist approach to a more structural and almost abstract conception of landscape. The mountain, located in the Provence region near his hometown of Aix-en-Provence, became an obsession for the artist, who depicted it in multiple variations, each capturing a different atmosphere and mood. In his early versions, Cézanne follows the principles of Impressionism, with looser brushstrokes and a luminous palette that emphasizes the effects of light on the rocky surface. However, as he progresses through the series, his approach becomes more analytical, eliminating superfluous details and breaking down the mountain into basic geometric shapes. In this process, his modulated brushstroke technique becomes more evident, building the image through small touches of color that structure the volume and generate a sense of solidity. The mountain is no longer just an element of the landscape, but a monumental, almost sculptural presence that dominates the composition with unwavering force. Mont Saint-Victoire series is crucial to Cézanne's oeuvre because it marks a turning point in the history of art. His way of structuring the image through color and geometry decisively influenced later movements such as Cubism and abstraction. His insistence on the underlying structure of nature, rather than a mere optical representation, broke with pictorial tradition and opened up new possibilities for artistic exploration in the 20th century. Cézanne demonstrated that painting did not have to be a mere window on the world, but an autonomous construction with its own internal rules. It is remarkable that Cézanne painted these mountain views from different angles and in different light and weather conditions, but always with the same purpose: to capture its essence through structure and color. His obsessive dedication to this subject reflects his conviction that art is not about reproducing reality as it is, but about understanding and reinterpreting it through the artist's eyes. In this sense, La Montagne Saint-Victoire is not just a series of landscapes, but a visual manifesto about painting as a language of its own, independent of mere observation. Number 1. The Great Bathers, 1906. In 1906 AD, Paul Cézanne completed his masterpiece, The Large Bathers, one of his most iconic paintings and the culmination of his exploration of form, color, and composition. This painting, belonging to the last stage of his career, is a synthesis of his post-impressionist style and his obsession with the geometric structure of nature and the human figure. Unlike the classic depictions of bathers in the history of art, Cézanne introduces a radical approach that breaks with academic tradition, reducing bodies to solid and simplified volumes, as if they were sculptures sculpted from canvas. The scene, in which a group of figures bathe in a natural setting, is not a mere realistic representation, but an artistic construction where color and form combine to create a unique visual harmony. From a technical perspective, the work moves away from the traditional modeling of the human figure and opts for a more abstract approach. The bodies of the bathers, far from being detailed with anatomical precision, are presented as geometric volumes, a characteristic that would influence later artistic movements, especially Cubism. The color palette is based on ochre, blue, and earthy tones that unify the composition and generate an effect of serenity and timelessness. Cézanne, obsessed with the relationship between color and form, uses structured brushstrokes that create a feeling of solidity and weight, giving the scene an almost sculptural presence. The integration of the landscape with the naked bodies reinforces his vision of nature as an organic and harmonious whole. Within Cézanne's body of work, the large bathers represents the culmination of his pictorial experiments. It is a piece that, while retaining the theme of mythological baths developed by artists such as Titian or Rubens, reformulates it with a radical modernity. The triangular structure of the composition and the rhythmic arrangement of the figures suggest a profound meditation on visual geometry, something that Cézanne had explored in his work over the years. His influence on artists such as Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque is undeniable, as these elements of simplification and geometric construction served as a basis for the development of Cubism in the 20th century. A curious detail about this work is that Cézanne worked on it until his last days, without considering it completely finished. Despite his deteriorating health, he continued to perfect the forms and balance of the composition, demonstrating his unwavering devotion to painting. It is a testament to his artistic philosophy, a relentless search for truth in the representation of nature and the human figure, not through mimesis, but through a deeply analytical and structured visual construction. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.